the government deficit and debt, and why that matters and what we need to know about it. So let's get into that. And what I'm going to do, this is actually a very much a definitional type topic. We have to understand some terminology before we can really get into the numbers, the graphs, and everything else that goes along with it. So before we can really understand deficits and debt, we've got to understand budgets, because that's where they come from. That's the basis of this whole thing. And budgets, the term budget gets misused a whole lot. So what's a budget? A budget is merely a plan. It's a plan of anticipated income and expenses, how much you plan on bringing in versus how much you plan on spending. And ultimately, we look at that plan and look at how it actually plays out in fruition, and then compare income and expenses to determine the actual status or balance of that budget. A government budget balance is the difference between receipts and outlays. Those are the specific terms that we'll use. By government receipts, we mean revenue, which comes primarily through taxes, so tax revenue. Through outlays, we're talking about all expenditures. We're talking about all kinds of government spending and transfers, both of which are going to be considering here. Budgets may be balanced, or they may be running at a deficit or a surplus. And those are the terms we have to get used to reading, and we have to get used to using. We don't talk about budgets going up or going down. And I know that in everyday conversation, we may say that, and that's perfectly normal. But in the context of AP Macro, when we talk about the status of a budget, we either say that the budget is balanced, or the budget is running at a deficit, or it's running at a surplus. What do those terms mean? Balanced budget, pretty simple. I don't want to insult your intelligence, but that would mean that income is equal to expenses. Revenue is equal to expenditures. Pretty simple there. A deficit is that situation where expenses are greater than income. Now stop and think about what that means for a minute. It means that there was a certain amount of income that came into this entity. If we're talking about the government, then it's essentially tax revenue that came in. They spent all that. They spent all the revenue that they got, and then they spent some more. Well, how do you do that? And this is going to bring back into mind the loanable funds market and other things. Well, there's two ways. If you're talking about a household in particular, you could have negative savings, take money out of savings, or what's maybe more obvious, especially in this situation, is you can borrow. And that's where deficits come into play, and that's where we're going to look at the effective deficits, both in the short and long run. A surplus is obviously the opposite. That's when you earn a certain amount of income, a certain amount of revenue, and you don't spend all of it. So whatever is earned in excess of expenditures, that's your budget surplus. And again, we're going to talk about all three of these and look at them in the context of a government or a federal budget and a federal budget balance. Moving forward, fiscal policy, both discretionary and automatic fiscal policy will impact that budget balance. And a lot of questions in AP Macro are going to be structured this way, where you're told an initial balance. Maybe you're told that this government has a balanced budget, policy is implemented, what happens next? Those are the types of scenarios we need to be able to respond to. Expansionary fiscal policy tends to lead to deficits. Why is that? Well, let's assume, again, that we start with a balanced budget where spending and revenue are equal. An expansionary fiscal policy is going to increase spending and or decrease taxes, spending up, revenue down. You're going to wind up in a scenario where expenditures are greater than receipts and you have a deficit. A contractionary fiscal policy could lead to a surplus. It's not a guarantee, but it could. It depends on what the starting point of that balanced or that budget would be. If in a purely hypothetical AP Macro context, you were told there's a balanced budget and a contractionary policy is implemented, that means tax rates go up, that means spending goes down, that means the revenue is going to exceed the spending, and you would have a surplus in that case. Now that's hypothetical, but it can happen. That can happen, even though we don't see it a lot in reality, it is possible. Deficits are going to lead to accumulated debt. In other words, deficit on top of deficit on top of deficit results in debt. And the important thing to take from this is that the words deficit and debt are not interchangeable. They do not mean the same thing. They're not synonymous. Deficits are understood to be annual measures. Debt is accumulated. So from one year to the next, governments may run up deficits by spending more than their total revenue. Over time, those deficits add up to accumulated debt. So the national debt of any country, we hear a lot about this in the news, is the accumulated debt of the nation's government. It's adding up all the surpluses and deficits over the course of that nation's history. Currently, in the US, the national debt is somewhere over $23 trillion. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to give you an exact number on that, but right here and 2020, that's about where we stand. That's saying that if you add it up cumulatively, all surpluses and deficits, all budget balances going back to 1790, you're going to get about $23 trillion worth of debt. Key questions, once we understand that definitional component, key questions we want to make sure we can understand and answer. Number one, how do governments do this? How do they borrow to finance deficit spending? I mean, yeah, obviously if there's a deficit, they're borrowing, but what does that mean? Does the federal government go to a bank and ask for money? Obviously not. They're not going and asking for a loan like we would. So how do they do that? By what mechanism do they borrow? We're going to talk about that in just a second. How do we illustrate the unintended consequences of deficits? Where do we go with this? What kind of graph can we use? Again, we've got to think back and go through an inventory of what we have covered. What markets and graphs have we used that might be able to illustrate this? And this will be a pretty obvious one based on what we've already talked about. And then are there other unintended consequences, things that we haven't thought about that may result because of deficits or year after year after year of high national debt, of a large national debt? Well, for the first question, how do they borrow? I'm not going to go into terribly great detail here, but you do need to know the mechanism that is used. We've talked a lot about securities in AP Macro, especially in Unit 4. We talk about the monetary policy side and the banking side of buying and selling securities in the open market. We have to remind ourselves of where these securities come from in the first place. We've been talking about Treasury securities. So I'm taking this from a US perspective, but most economies are going to work in the same way. Most governments work in the same way. That really every month, as in this country, the Treasury determines that, hey, we need some more money, we're going to spend all that tax revenue, securities are issued from the Treasury Department. And a security is simply an IOU. It's a sheet of paper. Well, it used to be a sheet of paper. Think of it as a sheet of paper that essentially says you're lending your money to government. They're going to pay you back at a later date, and they're going to pay you interest over time. And it's essentially a guaranteed payment over time. That's what securities are. And the way governments borrow money is by issuing those securities. Commercial banks primarily, but also foreign central banks, individuals, whomever, they can buy these securities and know they're going to get that interest payment back from government over time. So that's how government borrows. That question comes up. We're going to see this again later in this talk, actually, today. How do we illustrate unintended consequences of deficits? Well, we do so on the loanable funds market. So bring back that loanable funds market and let's remind ourselves, what are we dealing with here? We've got real interest rates on the y-axis. You've got quantity of loanable funds on the x. You've got savers represented by supply, borrowers represented by demand. So a deficit means that the federal government is borrowing money. So where do we put borrowers? We put borrowers on the demand curve. All right. So if the government's coming into the loanable funds market and government is borrowing money in this loanable funds market, what effect will it have? It's going to increase the demand for loanable funds. And in doing so, we're going to see a rise in interest rates. Interest rates are going to go up. And again, the overall quantity of loanable funds at equilibrium is also going to increase. So what's the unintended consequence? The unintended consequence is the increase in interest rates. If this is the result, let's just say it is, if it's the result of expansionary fiscal policy, or even if it's the result of automatic fiscal policies, the intention was never to raise interest rates. The intention was to stimulate economic activity. It was to get AD moving to the right. It was to boost output and lower unemployment. It was not to raise interest rates. That increase in interest rates can lead to some things that really fiscal policymakers may not want and may in some ways offset the intentions of the fiscal policy in the first place. But I'm not going to go further than that because that's your lesson for tomorrow. I'm going to leave you hanging, and that's where you're going to pick up tomorrow in terms of that unintended consequence. Are there other unintended consequences? Well, yeah, there are. There are going to be trade-offs that result. Simple fact is this is part of, again, the AP macro curriculum. A government must pay interest on its accumulated debt. We know that, thus increasing national debt, increasingly foregoing using those funds for alternative uses. In other words, go back to day one of economics when you were learning about scarcity and trade-offs. In this case, trade-offs are going to have to be made. And if we're going to spend more and more of our budget, if the government is going to spend more of its budget on servicing the debt, on paying increasing interest rates on the debt, something else has got to go. And that's a trade-off that has to take place. And again, we're not going to dive too deep into that, but it's a fact that you need to know that that potentially could be the result of high deficits and raising interest rates on that deficit and accumulated debt. Okay. All right, let's move forward. how and where do we see this applied? I think this is a place where it's appropriate to look at the data. So I'm going to look at data in two different ways. I'm going to give you a hypothetical first and just see how we actually calculate this stuff, because that does come up from time to time. How do you calculate deficit and debt? How do you obviously work those numbers together and make connections? And then we're going to look at some realistic data. I picked out one decade where some interesting trends occurred, and we're going to see that we can break that down and understand how that happened. So first and foremost, hypothetically, let's pretend somehow we look at a nation's first 5 years in existence. And what we have in this table would be annual figures, first of all, with receipts and outlays, annual figures representing potential budget figures. Maybe these numbers are in millions, they're much larger than they look right here. And we want to determine, what does that mean in terms of the annual budget balance, and what does that do to the accumulated debt? So maybe in year one, and I'm just going to say these numbers as if they were in, like I said, in millions, receipts were $100 billion, outlays were also $100 billion. Well, that means they brought in revenue of 100 billion, they spent that 100 billion, and that was it. Well, then they have a balanced budget. The budget balance is zero, national debt is zero. Move on to year two, and you see that receipts, tax revenue went up by 10 billion. Outlays, though, went up by 15. Who knows why? Something may have happened that made them have to increase their spending more. And as a result, outlays exceed receipts by $5 billion. And now you have a national debt in the amount of that deficit, because you started with zero debt. You add that deficit to the following year. The next year, receipts go up another 5, but outlays go up 10. And as a result, the deficit bounces up to $10 billion. That deficit, again, is going to accumulate, add on top of the previous year's debt, and your debt's now at 15 billion. If the next year receipts go up to 120, but outlays are constant, they stay at 125, well, then a deficit comes back down. And we hear this sometimes. You'll hear this in political campaigns. We're going to bring the deficit down. There's still a deficit, which is still going to add to the national debt. And again, that's an important point to keep in mind. Even when you shrink the deficit, you still have a deficit. You're still borrowing money, and the national debt continues to rise. It's not until year 5, where we see receipts exceeding outlays and a surplus exists, that the national debt actually starts to fall. So again, understanding the relationship between receipts, outlays, budget balance, and the debt is going to be important for you to understand these concepts and how they relate. And then we need to tie that all together to business cycle data, ADAS, and everything else, and see how they all connect in the big picture. So just briefly, I want to show you how this looks in reality, to some degree how it looks in reality, and how we can connect trends in these numbers to trends in the overall business cycle. I want to make sure you understand, disclaimer here, you don't have to know the actual data for the AP macro exam. You're not going to be asked about the numbers from any specific point in history, but knowing those trends is important, and seeing those trends in reality can be helpful. So here's actual budget data, and I chose the 1990s because it's a relatively unique period, especially in recent history, where we go from early 90s and relatively high deficits coming off of a recession into late 90s and a surplus. And in this country, we have not had a lot of surpluses since, say, the 1960s. Only about 5 years of surpluses have actually existed. Here are 4 of those 5 years, and it's worth looking at how this country, how the US got there. So if you go all the way back to 1992, in 92, we're coming off of a relatively brief recession, about an 8-month recession in 1991. And you have a deficit of $290 billion. Because outlays were almost 1.4, whereas receipts were just over $1 trillion. But as you look, this was apparently concerning to a lot of policymakers, and policies were introduced and then enforced throughout the 1990s that really curbed spending and controlled the growth in spending. It didn't stop spending. It didn't stop spending from increasing, but it did control the growth in spending, while at the same time, a growing economy led to increases in tax revenue. So what you're seeing here really is a combination. You're seeing a lot of those automatic stabilizers at play. As the economy grew, and we know that by the late 90s, the economy was very strong in this country. As the economy grew and incomes rose, tax revenues rose with them. Not because necessarily tax rates were increased. They were early on here, but not in the late 90s, but because output was growing so fast, incomes were rising, tax revenue went up as a result of that. While in the by the same token, outlays were not growing very fast. There were some policies put in place to keep that from happening. And that gap between the two that we're going to visualize in just a second, that gap between the two shrunk and shrunk and shrunk until in 1998, receipts passed outlays and you wound up with a surplus. Another way to look at that, this is a table from Fred St. Louis. I hope you're familiar with Fred. If you're not, this is a resource you're going to want to know anytime you're keeping up with or curious about economic data. This is from the Federal Reserve Economic Database at the St. Louis Fed. This table shows us in the blue line, government expenditures, and the red line, receipts, that same period we were just looking at. And if you look, obviously right here, we see the blue line, expenditures, is far higher than the red line, receipts. But as time goes on and tax receipts rise faster than spending, that gap gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So what does that mean? That means that the deficit is shrinking, which is exactly what we saw right here. We reach a point in 1998 where tax revenue passes spending, and now that red line, tax receipts, is greater than the blue line, expenditures, and that gap indicates we now have a surplus. That exists until what? Well, this gray line, if you're not familiar with bar notation, the gray line means we're in a recession again. 2001 was a recession, and predictably in a recession, what's going to happen to tax revenue? It's going to fall. Tax rates are going to fall, not because they were cut necessarily, they were, but not only because of that, but because individuals are earning less income, they're losing their jobs at the same time. Unemployment compensation is going up, and we go back into a deficit. We've been in deficits ever since then. Related to that is total public debt, the federal debt. So this is federal debt for roughly the same time period, and it has been rising for most of that period. But you'll see right here, as a result of the surpluses that we had for 4 years, you do have a short period of time where that federal debt is actually falling. That's the result of surpluses. And then once we go back into deficits, we start to see an increasing federal debt. Again, disclaimer, you don't have to know those actual figures, but it's good to see those trends. It's good to see how it actually pertains to reality, so you can contextualize this stuff and make it real. You're going to understand it a whole lot better if you're able to do that.